The sweet scent of sugar and vanilla hung thick in the air of the small bakery, a cloying perfume that contrasted sharply with the bitter taste of defeat in Daisy Evans's mouth. She stood at the counter, her knuckles white where she gripped the worn strap of her handbag. Across from her, Nancy, the bakery's owner and a friend since high school, watched with a kind of gentle pity that made Daisy's skin prickle. "I need to cancel Tyler's birthday cake," she whispered, and the words felt like shards of glass in her throat. Her voice cracked on his name. Canceling her son's 8th birthday cake, the one shaped like a soccer field that he had spent months designing in his little sketchbook, felt like the final, undeniable admission of failure. She felt the phantom weight of a dozen stares on her back, the silent judgment of a world that had no room for mothers who couldn't afford a simple cake. "Daisy, no," Nancy started, her expression softening. "We can figure something out, a payment plan." "I can't, Nance." Daisy's voice was firm now, a thin wall of pride holding back a flood of shame. She couldn't explain that her shifts at the diner had been cut, that the choice wasn't between the cake and a payment plan, but between the cake and the electricity bill sitting on her kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. "Something came up at work. It's just not possible this month." From a small table in the corner, Michael Turner watched the exchange over the rim of his coffee cup. He was just passing through this sleepy town, a detour on his way back to the relentless pace of Boston. He dealt in transactions worth billions, in algorithms and market projections, yet he found himself utterly captivated by the quiet dignity of the woman at the counter. He saw the way she held her shoulders back, as if bracing against an invisible weight. He saw the flicker of shame in her eyes, quickly masked by a fierce resolve. The scene was a ghost from his own past, a faint echo of his own mother, standing in a similar line, her face etched with the same quiet desperation he had been too young to understand. Daisy finally managed a weak, grateful smile for Nancy, turned, and walked out of the bakery. The little bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that felt like a mockery. Once inside the confines of her old, sputtering car, she leaned her forehead against the cold plastic of the steering wheel. The dam of her composure broke, but only for a moment. A single hot tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek before she wiped it away with a furious swipe of her hand. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Back inside the bakery, Michael rose from his table. He moved with the silent, purposeful grace of a man accustomed to command. He approached the counter where Nancy was still staring at the door, her face a mask of worry. "The cake she just canceled," he said, his voice a low, calm baritone. "The one for Tyler. I'll take care of it." Nancy blinked, surprised. "Oh, well, that's very kind of you, sir, but—" He held up a hand, a gesture that was gentle yet absolute. "And I heard it was a soccer theme?" He leaned in slightly, his focus entirely on her now. "Tell me about the party. Tell me about the boy." Minutes later, what had begun as a simple payment for a cake had morphed into something far grander. Nancy, her initial shock giving way to a dawning excitement, sketched out the details of Tyler's little world, his friends, his team, his absolute obsession with the sport. Michael listened, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just about the cake," he said, more to himself than to her. He pulled out his phone, his thumb already moving across the screen. "We're going to give this boy the best birthday of his life." He looked up, and his eyes, which had been cool and analytical, now held a flicker of unexpected warmth. "And his mother needs to know that her hard work is seen." He made a call, his voice dropping as he spoke to his assistant, the words a quiet storm of logistics. His entire weekend schedule, a carefully constructed fortress of meetings and obligations, was dismantled in under a minute. He ended the call and turned his full attention back to a stunned Nancy. "I need you to do me a favor," he said, his tone conspiratorial. "Call her best friend. We'll arrange everything. But on the day of the party, the surprise has to come from her." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "Daisy has to be the hero in her son's eyes. I don't want the credit." I want to give her back her power. The sun crept through the thin curtains of Tyler's bedroom on Saturday morning, carrying with it the weight of his 8th birthday. He woke up with a quiet resignation, expecting at most the special birthday pancakes his mom always made, the ones with chocolate chips arranged in a smiley face. He was old enough to understand the hushed phone calls, to feel the tension that settled in his mom's shoulders when she thought he wasn't looking. He knew things were hard, but when he walked into the kitchen, he found Daisy already dressed, a strange, bright hope shining in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in months. The familiar scent of pancakes was there, but her energy was different, electric. "Happy birthday, my love," she said, her voice full of a forced, trembling cheerfulness. After he'd devoured his breakfast, she knelt in front of him. "Go put on your soccer uniform, champ. I have a surprise for you." The words hung in the air, magical and unbelievable. Tyler's eyes widened, a flicker of pure, childish hope igniting in their depths. He didn't ask questions. He just ran to his room, his heart thumping with a wild, forgotten excitement. The drive to the local park was filled with a nervous silence. Daisy gripped the steering wheel, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and gratitude. Her best friend Sarah had called her late last night, her voice bubbling with a story about the community parents from the soccer league chipping in to give Tyler the party he deserved. It felt too big, too sudden, but Daisy was so desperate to believe in a simple act of kindness that she didn't question it. She just clung to the gift, this chance to see her son smile. When they pulled up to the soccer field, Tyler gasped. The sound was a small, sharp intake of breath, full of pure astonishment. The entire field was a sea of green and white balloons, twisting in the gentle breeze. A huge banner stretched between the goalposts, proclaiming in bold letters, "Happy birthday, Tyler." All his friends from school and his entire soccer team were there, erupting into a chorus of cheers the moment they saw him. In the center of it all was a long table laden with food, sodas, and a mountain of presents. And there, enthroned in the middle, was the cake. It was more perfect than his drawings, a miniature soccer stadium rendered in frosting, complete with tiny players and a shimmering green field. It was the cake of his dreams. "Mom, how?" Tyler whispered, his voice thick with awe as he turned to look at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. Daisy knelt and pulled him into a fierce hug, burying her face in his hair to hide her own tears. "I found a way, baby," she managed to say, her voice choked with an emotion so powerful it made her dizzy. In that moment, holding her ecstatic son, she felt like the most powerful mother in the world. From a distance, standing near an old oak tree, Michael watched the scene unfold. He felt a strange, unfamiliar tightening in his chest. The raw, unfiltered joy on Tyler's face was a currency he had never been able to trade, a profit margin he had never known. This feeling, this vicarious happiness, was more potent than any billion-dollar deal he had ever closed. He stayed apart for most of the party, an anonymous observer. But as things began to wind down, he saw Daisy standing alone for a moment, watching her son with a look of profound love. He took a breath and approached her, his steps quiet on the grass. "I'm Michael," he said simply, stopping a respectful distance away. Daisy turned, and recognition dawned on her face, followed by a wave of shock. The man from the bakery. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with a sudden, heart-stopping clarity. The community chipping in. It wasn't the community. It was him. A flush of gratitude mixed with a sharp, stinging humiliation washed over her. I can't accept this," she stammered, gesturing vaguely at the sprawling party. His expression was gentle, his eyes holding hers. "You don't have to," he replied, his voice soft. "This isn't charity, Daisy. Think of it as an investment in joy, something I'd forgotten how to do myself." Before she could respond, the party's hero came running up. Tyler, his face smeared with chocolate frosting and his eyes still sparkling, stopped in front of Michael. My mom said you're a soccer angel, he said with the solemn innocence only a child possesses. Thank you for the best day of my life. And then, Tyler did something that shattered Michael's carefully controlled world. He threw his small arms around the billionaire's waist and hugged him with all his might. For a fraction of a second, Michael froze. His body went rigid, unused to such spontaneous, genuine affection. Then, slowly, hesitantly, his own arms came up to rest on the boy's small back, his large hands patting him with an unpracticed awkwardness. In that moment, as he held the small, warm body, he felt a deep foundational crack in the fortress he had built around his heart. He looked up, his gaze meeting Daisy's over the top of her son's head. The space between them was charged, electric. The look that passed between them was no longer that of a benefactor and a beneficiary. It was something else entirely, something far more complicated. A few days after the party, the lingering sweetness of the memory was a balm on Daisy's weary soul. The world, however, had a way of snapping back to its harsh reality. When a note appeared in her cubby at the school library requesting her presence in the principal's office, a familiar, cold dread coiled in her stomach. In her experience, unexpected meetings with authority figures never meant good news. She braced herself for another round of budget cuts, perhaps a reduction in her already limited hours. She walked into Principal Miller's office, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, a posture of nervous deference she had perfected over the years. He gestured for her to sit, his face uncharacteristically bright. "Daisy, thank you for coming," he began, his smile doing little to ease her anxiety. "I have some rather extraordinary news. An anonymous foundation has approached the school. They've established a new scholarship program specifically for our support staff who wish to pursue a full teaching degree." Daisy's heart gave a painful thud. She listened, her mind struggling to keep up. "It covers full tuition, books, and even provides a living stipend to help with childcare and other expenses," he continued, his voice full of genuine excitement. "And the Foundation's board had a specific recommendation for the very first recipient." He paused, leaning forward. "They recommended you, Daisy." The world tilted. The principal's voice faded into a distant hum, a scholarship, a full ride. It was the dream she had packed away in a dusty box years ago, a ghost of a life she had once imagined for herself before marriage, before Tyler, before the slow erosion of her own ambitions. Her mind, a frantic mess of disbelief and dawning hope, landed on one name. Michael. It had to be him. The sheer scale of the generosity was overwhelming, a tidal wave of kindness that threatened to drown her. But it was also deeply unsettling. It felt too targeted, too personal. She felt less like she was being helped and more like she was being curated, her life a project being managed by a wealthy, benevolent stranger. That night, sleep was impossible. She tossed and turned, the gratitude warring with a fierce, protective pride. She couldn't just accept this. She couldn't live her life feeling like a debt that could never be repaid. Through Nancy, who had become a reluctant keeper of secrets, she managed to get an email address for Michael's foundation. Her fingers trembled as she typed out a careful message, editing it a dozen times. She thanked him for his presumed generosity but questioned the intensity of it. She needed to understand why. The reply came in less than 10 minutes, a testament to a man who never truly disconnected. His response was formal, almost clinical. "Ms. Evans, my foundation manages dozens of philanthropic programs. I did not create this specific scholarship, but when the board presented the initiative, I did suggest your name. I believe in investing in people who show potential. You show potential. There is nothing more to it than that." The cool professional tone was both a relief and, to her surprise, a disappointment. It put a safe, sterile distance between them. She was just an investment, a name on a file. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But just as she was about to close her laptop, a second email notification pinged. It was from him again. "P.S. My name is Michael. and I would be interested to hear your thoughts on how we can make these programs more effective for single parents. Perhaps over coffee. As a consultant, of course. Daisy stared at the screen, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. Consultant. The word was a lifeline. It reframed everything. It wasn't a date. It wasn't charity. It was a job. It was a way for her to contribute, to offer something of value, to maintain the fragile armor of her pride. It was a way for her to pay him back, not with money, but with her experience. "I accept," she typed back, her fingers flying across the keys. But as she hit send, a traitorous, honest question echoed in the quiet of her small apartment. Was she accepting the role of consultant? Or was she accepting the chance to once again see the man whose impossible kindness had left her utterly breathless? The cafe was a carefully chosen neutral ground, a sleek, minimalist space halfway between the quiet humility of her town and the towering ambition of his Boston office. Michael was already there when she arrived, seated at a corner table. He was dressed in dark jeans and a simple gray sweater, a deliberate departure from the power suits she imagined he wore. Yet even in casual attire, an aura of quiet authority clung to him like a second skin. It was in the way he held his shoulders, the focused intensity in his eyes as he scanned a document on his phone. Daisy approached the table, clutching a notebook to her chest like a shield. She had spent the last 2 nights preparing, scribbling down thoughts and ideas, determined to prove her worth in this new, surreal role. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Turner," she began, her voice coming out more formal than she intended. He looked up, and a slow smile spread across his face, instantly softening the severe lines of his features. The smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Michael," he corrected gently, "and I should be thanking you. I'm in desperate need of a dose of reality." The initial awkwardness melted away as the coffee arrived. The conversation started professionally, centered on the scholarship. But as Daisy began to speak, her passion took over. She spoke of the crushing, invisible logistics that plagued single parents trying to better themselves. The prohibitive cost of childcare that often outweighed the potential salary increase from a new degree. The bone-deep exhaustion of studying after a child was asleep. The constant, gnawing guilt of feeling like you were failing at everything at once, as a parent, as a student, as an employee. Michael listened with a stillness that was unnerving. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer glib, easy solutions. He simply absorbed her words, his gaze fixed on her face. When she finished, he asked questions. Sharp, insightful questions that showed he wasn't just hearing her problems, but truly trying to understand the intricate, exhausting architecture of them. For the first time in years, Daisy felt seen, not pitied, but understood. Inevitably, the professional conversation bled into the personal. Surprising himself, Michael began to talk. He spoke of his divorce, not with bitterness, but with a kind of detached sadness. He spoke of the profound isolation that success had built around him, a fortress of glass and steel. "People stop seeing you," he admitted, his voice a low murmur. "They see your bank account. They see what you can do for them. The person becomes an abstract." Daisy met his gaze across the table, a sudden, powerful wave of empathy washing over her. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," she replied softly. The admission hung in the charged space between them. They were 2 people from opposite ends of the universe, connected by the shared, lonely experience of being overlooked. The air grew thick with unspoken things. When the waitress came to clear their cups, it felt like an intrusion. Michael looked at his watch, a flicker of disappointment on his face. "Your perspective is invaluable," he said, his tone shifting back toward the professional, yet his eyes held a different story. "We need to continue this conversation. Dinner. As part of your ongoing consultancy, of course." Daisy hesitated. The word was there, consultancy. But the invitation felt different. A coffee in the afternoon was business. A dinner at night. That felt like crossing a line she hadn't even known existed. The space between them crackled with a new tension. "I don't know, Michael." Before he could press, her phone buzzed violently on the table, the screen lighting up with the name of Tyler's school. Her heart leaped into her throat. She answered, her hand trembling. The school nurse's voice was calm but urgent. Tyler had taken a fall on the playground. He was okay, but he had a nasty gash on his chin. He needed to go to the hospital for stitches. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. The world narrowed to the nurse's voice, the frantic thumping of her own heart. Michael saw the color drain from her face, the terror in her eyes. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, he stood up, pulling his wallet from his pocket and dropping a few bills on the table. "I'll take you," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "Let's go." The carefully constructed walls of their professional arrangement had just been obliterated by a real-world crisis. The connection they had just begun to forge was about to be tested by fire. The hospital waiting room was a sterile, beige purgatory, and for Daisy, it was a blur of anxiety. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against her frayed nerves. Beside her, Michael was a bastion of calm. He didn't offer empty platitudes or try to minimize her fear. He was just there, a solid grounding presence in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. He had procured a cup of water for her, his hand steady as he passed it to her trembling one. The simple gesture felt monumental. When a nurse finally called Tyler's name, Daisy shot to her feet. The little boy emerged from behind a set of double doors, his face pale and tear-streaked, a stark white bandage taped clumsily to his chin. His lower lip trembled. "Mommy," he whimpered, his eyes wide with post-traumatic shock. Daisy's heart shattered. She rushed forward, but Tyler, in a move that stunned her, sidestepped her outstretched arms and ran straight to Michael. He buried his face against the soft fabric of Michael's sweater, his small body shaking with sobs. "Mr. Michael, it hurts so much," he cried, his voice muffled. Michael, once again, froze for a split second, a flicker of sheer panic in his eyes at being the chosen comfort. Then, instinct took over. He knelt, his movements fluid, bringing himself down to the boy's level. His hand came up to gently stroke Tyler's hair. "I know, champ. I know it did," he murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "But you were brave, the bravest guy in this whole hospital." From that moment on, Michael handled the situation with a quiet, surprising competence. While Daisy's focus was entirely on comforting her son, Michael became her partner. He spoke with the nurses, his tone calm and authoritative, and managed to procure a bright red popsicle that worked like magic to stem Tyler's tears. He navigated the labyrinth of insurance forms and discharge papers, shielding Daisy from the bureaucratic nightmare so she could simply be a mother. Watching him in this environment, so capable and tender, so naturally protective, stirred something deep inside her, something warm and dangerous. They were waiting for the final paperwork when a new figure appeared in the waiting room doorway. He was handsome in a way that had once made Daisy's heart flutter, his smile easy and charming. It was Mark, her ex-husband. "Hey, I heard what happened," he said, striding into the room as if he owned it. He completely bypassed Michael, his focus solely on Daisy and Tyler. "Dee, you look exhausted. Let me take over from here." He knelt by Tyler, but his words were for her, laced with a familiar, condescending intimacy that made her skin crawl. He had always done this, swooped in after a crisis, playing the part of the concerned father without ever doing the hard work. The air in the room shifted, growing thick and heavy. The tension between the two men was immediate, a silent, crackling current of territorial energy. Mark finally stood up, his gaze flicking over to Michael for the first time, dismissing him as an irrelevant bystander. "And you are?" Mark asked, his tone laced with casual arrogance. Michael met his gaze, his own eyes turning cool, hard as polished steel. He extended a hand, his posture unyielding. "Michael Turner," he said, his voice level and clear. "A friend of the family." The way he enunciated the word family was not a simple statement. It was a declaration. It was a shield placed firmly in front of Daisy and her son. Mark's practiced smile faltered as he took in the expensive, understated watch on Michael's wrist, the quiet power in his stance. He hesitated, his bravado deflating slightly. Daisy stood frozen between them, a spectator in a drama about her own life. She was trapped between the man who represented a past full of disappointment and broken promises, and the man who offered a future that was as terrifying as it was promising. The nurse returned with the discharge papers. "All right, you're all set to go home." The question hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Who would be taking them? The silence in the waiting room stretched, thin and taut. Both men looked at her, their expectations a tangible weight. Mark, with his easy, possessive smile, assumed his place was a given. Michael's expression was unreadable, a mask of calm neutrality, but Daisy could feel the quiet intensity of his gaze. For years she had deferred to Mark, smoothing over conflicts for Tyler's sake, choosing the path of least resistance. But something had shifted. It was the memory of Michael's steady presence, the sight of his gentle hand on her son's back, the quiet power with which he had claimed the title of friend of the family. "We're going with Michael." The words left her lips before she had even fully formed the thought. Her voice was quiet, but it resonated with a firmness that surprised even herself. She saw a flicker of shock in Mark's eyes, quickly replaced by a flash of irritation. She didn't wait for his response. She took Tyler's small hand in hers, gave it a reassuring squeeze, and walked toward Michael. It was a small act, just a few steps across a linoleum floor, but it felt like crossing a continent. It was the first time she had actively chosen a potential future over the familiar comfort of her past. The car ride was thick with a new kind of tension. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged. Tyler, exhausted from the ordeal, and lulled by the smooth motion of the luxury car, quickly fell asleep in the back, his head lolling against the soft leather. "Thank you," Daisy said into the quiet, her gaze fixed on the passing streetlights. "Back there, with him." Michael kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "He has a way of making you feel small," he stated, not as a question, but as an observation. "Yes," she breathed, a wave of relief washing over her. "He does." He just nodded, a simple, affirming gesture. He didn't need her to explain. He understood. That, she was beginning to realize, was Michael's rarest gift. When they arrived at her modest apartment building, he didn't just drop them off at the curb. He parked the car, unbuckled a sleeping Tyler with practiced ease, and lifted him into his arms. Daisy's heart did a strange, painful flip as she watched him carry her son up the 3 flights of stairs without a hint of effort, his movements sure and protective. After she had tucked Tyler into bed, pulling the superhero-themed comforter up to his chin, she walked back out to the living room. Michael hadn't left. He was standing in the center of the small room, looking at a collection of framed photos on a bookshelf. He was holding one in particular, a picture of her on her high school graduation day, her face bright with unfiltered joy and optimism, her diploma clutched in her hand. "You look happy," he said, his voice soft. "I was," she replied, a wistful ache in her chest. She walked to stand beside him, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne. "That was before I dropped out of college to marry Mark, before I gave up on myself." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. She hadn't meant to say it, but with him, the truth seemed to surface on its own. He turned to face her, his gaze gentle. "It's never too late to find yourself again, Daisy." The space between them shrank. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken possibilities. He was so close now she could see the flecks of gray in his dark eyes. He was going to say something more. He was going to close the final inch between them. He was going to kiss her. Her own breath hitched in anticipation, a terrifying, thrilling flutter in her stomach. And then his phone rang. The sound was jarring, a violent intrusion. He flinched, pulling the phone from his pocket as if it were a venomous snake. The name on the screen made his jaw tighten. He turned away slightly as he answered, but she could still hear the strained edge in his voice. "Mom, now is not a good time. No, she is not another one of my charity projects. Please, just don't get involved." He ended the call abruptly, his face a mask of frustration and deep, profound embarrassment. He turned back to Daisy, the intimate spell between them shattered into a million pieces. "I'm sorry about that," he said, his voice rough. "My mother can be intrusive." But Daisy had barely heard his apology. Her mind was stuck on a single, devastating phrase, replaying it over and over. Charity project. The words hit her like a physical blow, cold and sharp, resurrecting every single one of her insecurities. Was that all she was to him? A broken thing to be fixed? A project to satisfy his need to feel powerful? The warmth that had been blooming in her chest turned to ice. "Does she think I'm a charity project?" The question was a sliver of ice in the suddenly cold room. Daisy's voice was quiet, but it was brittle, sharp with a pain that was indistinguishable from anger. The soft, vulnerable woman from moments ago was gone, replaced by someone guarded and proud. The walls she had cautiously begun to lower were now being rebuilt, brick by painful brick. Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure, unadulterated frustration. He looked cornered, trapped by his mother's careless words and his own inability to explain. "No, of course not," he said, but the denial sounded weak, unconvincing even to his own ears. "She doesn't know you. She only knows my pattern. I have a tendency to try and fix things. It's a flaw." "A flaw?" Daisy's laugh was short and humorless. "It seems more like a hobby. And I am not something to be fixed, Michael." The dam of her composure broke, and the words she had been holding back came pouring out. "I didn't need a savior. I needed a chance. You gave me that, and I will be forever grateful. But I am not a broken toy for you to mend so you can feel good about yourself. I am not a project you can manage with your money." Her accusation, born of deep-seated insecurity and the fresh sting of humiliation, struck a nerve. "That's not what this is," he shot back, his own voice rising with a defensive edge. "I was just trying to help." "By controlling everything?" she countered. "The party, the scholarship, the hospital? You just sweep in and take over. You don't leave any room for my own pride, my own agency." The fight was ugly and confusing, fueled by a potent cocktail of miscommunication and unspoken fears. It ended abruptly, with no resolution. Michael, looking both wounded and furious, muttered a clipped, "I should go," and walked out, the quiet click of the apartment door sealing the space between them. Daisy was left alone in the silence, her heart aching with a confusing mix of anger and regret. The next day at the library was torture. Every quiet moment was filled with the echo of their argument. Around noon, a woman walked in, her presence immediately commanding the quiet space. She was in her 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer and pearls, her silver hair styled perfectly. She moved with an air of effortless elegance and authority. She scanned the room, her sharp eyes landing on Daisy. "You must be Daisy," the woman said, her voice smooth and confident as she approached the circulation desk. "I'm Eleanor Turner, Michael's mother." Daisy's heart plummeted. She braced herself for a lecture, for a condescending speech about knowing her place. But Eleanor's expression wasn't hostile. It was direct, appraising, and surprisingly, apologetic. "My son," she began without any preamble, "is a genius with numbers and a complete idiot with people, especially people he cares about. I came here to apologize for what you overheard on the phone. It was a clumsy, unfair thing for me to say." She paused, her gaze softening slightly. "And I also came to meet you." Eleanor invited her for tea at the small cafe across the street, an invitation that felt more like a royal summons. Over Earl Grey and scones, Eleanor revealed a side of her son that Daisy had never imagined. She spoke of his deep loneliness, the profound heartbreak of his divorce from a woman who had loved his status more than the man. She described his desperate, clumsy desire to connect with something real, something genuine, but his complete lack of knowledge on how to do it without using the only tool he truly understood, his wealth. "He isn't trying to fix you, my dear," Eleanor said, her shrewd eyes holding Daisy's. They were the same intense eyes as her son's, but laced with a wisdom he had yet to earn. "He's trying to fix himself, through you." Daisy listened, her anger slowly dissolving, replaced by a dawning, complicated understanding. And then, Eleanor delivered the final, decisive blow. "He canceled his trip to Japan for you, you know," she said casually, as if discussing the weather. "A $1 billion negotiation with our partners in Tokyo. He told his board of directors he had an urgent and immovable consultancy to attend to in Riverdale." Daisy stared at her, speechless. The air left her lungs. $1 billion. He had walked away from a $1 billion deal. For her. For a coffee. The very thing she had seen as an obstacle, a sign of his overbearing control, was in fact the most profound proof of his commitment. The ground shifted beneath her feet once again. The knowledge settled into Daisy's bones, a warm, spreading certainty that chased away the last of her anger. $1 billion. The number was so vast, so abstract, it was almost meaningless. But the choice behind it was crystal clear. He hadn't seen her as an obligation. He had seen her as a priority. Armed with this new understanding, she knew she couldn't just let things lie. She had to make a gesture of her own, something to bridge the gap that had opened between them. She couldn't compete with his money, but she could give him something he couldn't buy. A genuine piece of her world. She found his number and dialed before she could lose her nerve. He answered on the second ring, his voice guarded and cool. "Michael," she said, her own voice steady and clear. "Do you still require my consultancy services?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I do," he said finally, his tone softening with cautious curiosity. "Good," she replied, a smile touching her lips. "Because I have an assignment for you. Saturday, my place, and bring clothes that can get dirty." On Saturday morning, Michael appeared at her apartment door looking thoroughly perplexed, dressed in expensive-looking jeans and a brand-new work shirt that was still stiff. Daisy, holding Tyler's hand, simply smiled and led him to her car. They drove to the community park, the same one where he had thrown Tyler's birthday party. They walked past the playground to the children's soccer field at the far end. The grass was patchy and worn, the goalposts rusted, the lines faded. She handed him a heavy roll of turf from a pile that had been delivered earlier, a donation from a local landscaping company she had sweet-talked. "Today," she announced, handing him a rake, "you are not the billionaire, and I am not the scholarship recipient. We are just two community parents, fixing up the field for the kids." For a moment, Michael just stared at the rake in his hand as if it were a foreign object. A flicker of something, amusement, disbelief, crossed his face. Then he looked at Tyler, who was already eagerly unrolling a section of sod, and then back at Daisy, who was watching him with a challenging glint in her eye. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. To Daisy's astonishment, he dove into the work. He was clumsy at first, but he was a quick study. Soon he was laughing, a real, uninhibited sound, as he got dirt on his face. He got into a playful competition with Tyler to see who could lay their patch of grass faster. For a few precious hours, under the warm afternoon sun, he wasn't Michael Turner, the tech mogul. He was just Michael, a man kneeling in the dirt, his hands stained with earth, his face flushed with exertion. At the end of the day, they collapsed onto the newly laid grass, exhausted, sore, and filthy. Daisy unpacked the simple sandwiches and lemonade she had brought. They ate in a comfortable silence, the shared labor having created a new, easy intimacy between them. "This was the best board meeting I've had in a long time," Michael said, his voice full of a sincere contentment that moved her deeply. The peaceful moment was shattered by the purr of a high-end engine. A sleek, black convertible pulled up alongside the field, its arrival an aggressive intrusion into their quiet world. A woman emerged from the driver's seat. She was stunningly beautiful, dressed in a white dress that seemed to glow against her tanned skin, her expression a mask of cold fury. "Michael, I've been calling you for hours," she snapped, her voice sharp and brittle. "We had the hospital gala in Boston. You were the guest of honor." It was his ex-wife, Catherine. Her cold, dismissive gaze swept over the scene, lingering on Daisy and Tyler with undisguised contempt. "So this is why you've been hiding out in the middle of nowhere?" she sneered, a cruel smile twisting her perfect lips. "Playing house with the common folk. How pathetic." Michael was on his feet in an instant, his body instinctively positioning itself as a shield in front of Daisy and Tyler. His face was hard, his eyes glacial. "Go home, Catherine." "Oh, I'm not leaving," she retorted, taking a step closer. "Not before I tell your new pet project exactly who she's dealing with." She fixed her venomous gaze on Daisy. "Ask him about the prenup, sweetheart. Ask him what happens to his little distractions when he gets tired of them." The silence Catherine left in her wake was heavy and toxic. Her words hung in the air, a poisonous vapor that choked the easy intimacy they had just built. Daisy looked at Michael, her heart hammering a slow, painful rhythm against her ribs. "What did she mean, Michael?" The question was a whisper, fragile and uncertain. He looked devastated, as if Catherine had not just attacked her, but had ripped open an old wound in him. He raked a hand through his hair, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. "My prenuptial agreement with Catherine was... It was complicated," he began, his voice strained. "I was protecting my company, my legacy. She's twisting it, Daisy. That's what she does." He tried to explain, but the words came out wrong. He spoke of lawyers and clauses, of asset protection and hostile takeover clauses. He was trying to explain the logic of his world, but to Daisy it sounded cold, clinical, and calculating. It was a world where love was a liability, a risk to be managed and mitigated by legal documents. The warmth of the afternoon sun seemed to vanish, replaced by a sudden bone-deep chill. The seed of doubt Catherine had so maliciously planted began to sprout. What happens to his little distractions when he gets tired of them? Was that what she was? A pleasant diversion from his high-stakes life? A temporary project? What would happen when the novelty wore off, when she was no longer a puzzle for him to solve? Would she and Tyler be gently but firmly set aside, their lives improved but their hearts broken? In the days that followed, Daisy retreated into herself. She built a wall of polite distance, focusing on her new college courses with a ferocious intensity. She answered Michael's calls with brief, non-committal responses, always having a plausible excuse to decline his invitations. She needed space to think, to untangle the knot of gratitude, affection, and terrifying fear in her chest. During this self-imposed exile, Mark, her ex-husband, saw an opening. He reappeared, not with his usual bluster, but with a new, softer approach. He was charming, attentive, and full of promises. He said he had changed, that seeing another man with his son had been a wake-up call. He wanted to be a better father, to be more involved. He invited her to dinner, just to talk about Tyler, to get on the same page. Reluctantly, feeling the familiar pressure to keep the peace for her son's sake, Daisy agreed. She chose a small, family-owned Italian restaurant in the center of town, a place she felt was safe, public, and unassuming. The dinner was surprisingly pleasant. Mark was on his best behavior, asking about her classes, listening intently. For a moment, she saw a glimpse of the man she had first fallen in love with. As they waited for the check, he reached across the table, his expression earnest. "I miss this, Dee," he said, his voice low. "I miss us. I made a mistake." His fingers were just about to brush against hers. At that exact moment, the restaurant door opened. Michael stood there. He had clearly driven down from Boston on a whim, a hopeful, almost boyish expression on his face, a single rose held loosely in his hand. His eyes scanned the room, found her, and then froze. His gaze dropped to the table, to the intimate setting, to Mark's hand reaching for hers. The hope on his face vanished, replaced by a look of such profound, quiet devastation that it stole the air from Daisy's lungs. The hurt hardened in a split second into a mask of cold, impenetrable indifference. Without a word, he turned on his heel and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving Daisy staring at the empty space where he had stood. The sight of Michael's retreating back sent a jolt of pure panic through Daisy. She shot to her feet so abruptly that her knee hit the table, sending a glass of water tipping over, the spill spreading across the red and white checkered tablecloth like a spreading stain of regret. "I have to go," she said, her voice a breathless rush of air. She threw a few bills onto the table, not even looking at Mark's bewildered face, and ran out of the restaurant. The cool night air hit her, but the street was empty. The sleek, dark car that she now knew so well was gone, having vanished into the darkness as silently and completely as he had. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling and clumsy as she dialed his number. It rang, and rang, and rang, each unanswered tone a fresh twist of the knife in her gut, before finally clicking over to his cold, impersonal voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. She sent a frantic text message. "Michael, it's not what it looked like. Please call me." The screen remained dark. No reply. She sent another. "He's Tyler's father. We were just talking. Please." Silence. The silence from his end was absolute, a solid wall of brick she couldn't see or break through. For the first time, she was on the other side of that wall, the one trying to reach someone who clearly did not want to be found. A wave of nausea washed over her. This feeling, this frantic, desperate ache in her chest, it had nothing to do with gratitude for a party or a scholarship. It wasn't about the money or the help. It was the sharp, terrifying pain of losing someone she... The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She loved him. She, Daisy Evans, a small-town waitress and library assistant, was in love with Michael Turner, the complicated, guarded, impossibly kind billionaire. The thought was so overwhelming, so terrifying, that she had to lean against the cold brick of the restaurant wall to keep her knees from buckling. 2 days passed in a state of agonizing, silent torture. She went through the motions of her life, classes, work, making dinner for Tyler, but it was all in a fog. She checked her phone 100 times an hour, her heart leaping at every notification, only to sink again when it wasn't from him. The silence was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered her. On the third morning, she was numbly scrolling through the news on her phone while waiting for her coffee to brew, when a headline made her heart stop. Sinclair tech stocks plummet as rival launches surprise competitor. With a trembling hand, she clicked the link. The article detailed a corporate bloodbath. A smaller, aggressive competitor had launched a revolutionary new product, catching Michael's company completely off guard and threatening to make their flagship technology obsolete overnight. The market was in a panic. The stock was in freefall. The article described Michael as being in war mode, locked in his Boston headquarters with his top executives, working around the clock to stop the bleeding. Daisy stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening lurch. His silence. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about Mark or the restaurant. While she had been drowning in her own small-town drama, his entire world, the empire he had spent his life building, was crumbling around him. She felt a fresh wave of panic, but this time it was for him. She knew she couldn't call now. He wouldn't answer. He was in his fortress, fighting a war, and he had shut out the world. He had shut her out. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, at the worried, helpless face staring back at her. She couldn't be another problem for him to deal with. She couldn't be a distraction. She had to be something else. She grabbed her car keys from the hook by the door. Boston was a 2-hour drive. She didn't have a plan. She just knew she had to go. The lobby of Sinclair Tech was a cathedral of glass and steel, designed to intimidate. Daisy, in her simple jeans and worn jacket, felt like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a hawk's nest. The receptionist, a chic woman with a headset and an air of bored superiority, looked her up and down with a dismissive glance. "I'm sorry, Mr. Turner is not seeing anyone today," she said, her tone final, already turning her attention back to her computer screen. Daisy took a deep, steadying breath, channeling a courage she didn't know she possessed. "Please tell him that his consultant from Riverdale is here," she said, her voice even and firm. "And tell him it's an emergency." The word emergency, combined with the unfamiliar title, was enough to make the receptionist pause. With a sigh of profound irritation, she spoke into her headset. A moment later, her eyes widened slightly. She looked at Daisy with a newfound grudging respect and gestured toward the security gates. The executive floor was organized chaos. People in expensive suits rushed past, their faces tight with stress, speaking in hushed, urgent tones into their phones. It felt like the command center of an army under siege. Through a glass wall at the end of the hall, she saw him. Michael was in the center of a conference room, looking like a king whose kingdom was on fire. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie was gone, and a dark stubble shadowed his jaw. He looked exhausted, furious, and magnificent. He was arguing with his team, his hands slashing through the air to emphasize a point, when his gaze lifted and met hers through the glass. His face for a split second was a mask of pure, unguarded shock. It was quickly replaced by a flash of anger. He said something sharp to his team, then strode out of the room, pulling the heavy glass door shut behind him with a quiet thud. "What are you doing here, Daisy?" he demanded, his voice a low, harsh rasp. He was blocking her path, a formidable wall of stress and exhaustion. "I don't have time for this." The force of his anger, the cold dismissal in his eyes, should have made her flinch, should have made her retreat. But it didn't. She saw past the anger to the deep, bone-weary panic beneath it. "I know," she said calmly, her voice a quiet anchor in his storm. She held up a simple brown paper bag she had been clutching. "But you have time to eat." He stared at the bag as if he'd never seen one before. "And you have time," she continued softly, "to breathe. For 5 minutes." He just stared at her, his mind clearly still racing with stock prices and counter-strategies. He had been expecting a scene, a confrontation about the restaurant, a tearful plea. He was prepared for a fight. He was not prepared for this. He was not prepared for a simple, unconditional act of care. The sheer, unexpected simplicity of it disarmed him completely. The rigid lines of his body seemed to soften, the anger in his eyes dissolving into a raw, weary vulnerability. "I saw you with him," he finally whispered, the real source of his pain surfacing now that his anger had no target. "I know," she replied, her gaze unwavering, "and we will talk about it. I promise, but not now." She took a small step closer, into his space. "Right now, you have a company to save." She looked him directly in the eye, her voice dropping, becoming intimate and strong. "And I will be right here, waiting in your office, for when you're done. I am not a distraction, Michael. I am your safe harbor." Without waiting for his permission, she brushed past him and walked toward the imposing doors of his private office, leaving him standing alone in the chaotic hallway. He looked down at the brown paper bag in his hand as if it were a lifeline, then back at the closed door of his office where she had disappeared. He had a war to win, but for the first time, he knew he had a reason to win it, and a place to come home to when the fighting was over. When Michael walked back into the conference room, something in him had shifted. The frantic, reactive energy was gone, replaced by a sharp, cold focus. The exhaustion was still etched on his face, but his eyes were clear, his commands precise. He was no longer just a man trying to save his company. He was a general leading a charge, inspired by the quiet certainty that he had something vital to fight for. Hours bled into one another. Coffee was consumed by the gallon. Whiteboards were filled with frantic scribbles, erased, and filled again. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to streak the sky over the Boston skyline, they had it. A plan. A risky, audacious, brilliant plan to counter their rivals' move. The crisis was far from over, but for the first time in days, there was a tangible path forward. As his team dispersed, buzzing with a renewed, nervous energy, Michael didn't go home. He walked down the silent, carpeted hallway to his office. He pushed the door open quietly. The room was dark, save for the ambient glow of the city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He saw her immediately. Daisy was curled up on the long leather sofa, fast asleep, her head pillowed on the jacket she had worn. Her face, in repose, was peaceful, a small island of tranquility in the heart of his chaotic world. The sight of her there, so trusting and so patient, hit him with a force that left him breathless. He had spent his life acquiring things, companies, properties, art. But he had never had this. He had never had someone who would willingly enter his storm and simply wait for it to pass. He found a soft cashmere blanket in a nearby closet and gently draped it over her, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was feather-light, reverent. He didn't wake her. Instead, he sank into the large armchair opposite the sofa and just watched her sleep. The fierce, protective love he felt for her a palpable, living thing in the quiet room. He finally understood that the strength of his empire meant nothing without the strength he drew, just from having her near. When Daisy finally stirred, the morning sun was casting long shadows across the office. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, before her eyes found him. He was watching her, his expression soft and unguarded. "Hi," she whispered, her voice husky with sleep. "Hi," he replied, a small, tired smile touching his lips. The air was clear between them now, the anger and stress of the previous day washed away. They talked. She explained about Mark, about the difficult, delicate dance of co-parenting, about her feeling of obligation to maintain a fragile peace for Tyler. He listened without interruption, his gaze full of a new, profound understanding. When she was finished, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked vulnerable, stripped of his usual armor of wealth and power. "When I saw you in that restaurant," he confessed, his voice low and raw, "my first thought wasn't that you were betraying me. My first thought was that I wasn't enough. That a normal guy like him, someone from your world, was what you really wanted. Not a complicated billionaire with a toxic ex-wife and a life lived under a microscope." The admission of his own insecurity, his own fear of not being worthy of her, was the most intimate thing he had ever shared. It was a confession that leveled the playing field between them completely. She wasn't the only one who felt insecure. He, Michael Turner, the man who had everything, was just as afraid of losing her as she was of losing him. She was about to respond, to tell him how wrong he was, when his phone, sitting on the desk, began to buzz insistently. The screen lit up with a name. Eleanor. He sighed and reached for it. "I should probably..." But before he could answer, his mother sent a text. "Michael, turn on the news. Now." He found the remote and switched on the large screen mounted on the wall. A national news channel filled the screen. And there, sitting in a plush chair opposite a famous journalist, was Catherine. His blood ran cold. "And sources within the company," Catherine was saying, her face a mask of faux concern, are worried that Mr. Turner's current emotional instability, fueled by his new obsession, is what's truly crippling Sinclair Tech from within. She was using the crisis. She was using his name. And with every carefully chosen, poisonous word, she was painting a target on the back of the woman sleeping on his couch. She's going to destroy me. Michael's voice was a hollow whisper, the sound of a man watching his